We're in the National Gallery, and we're looking at Jan van Eyck's portrait of, well, I learned this painting as the Arnolfini wedding portrait.
So did I.
But there's been a lot of scholarship subsequently,
Yep.
and there's a lot of disagreement over what this painting actually represents. The mirror in the center is really one of the most compelling elements. You have not only, in a sense, the greater visual reality of this room depicted, because we can actually see as if we're standing in the back of the room looking forward, but you see actually
Scenes from the Passion of Christ.
painted on the back pieces of glass panels that are set into that wooden frame.
Right, and I have to say that it's hard to get a sense of this when you're watching a video or looking at illustrations in a book, but those little roundels around the mirror, well, how big would you say those are?
They are, I would say, about half the
Half
size
an
of
inch.
half the size of my fingernail.
Yeah, they're tiny. And yet we can make out what scenes from the Passion of Christ are represented there. There's that attention to detail, and detail painted in enormous clarity that we associate with the Northern Renaissance.
So, some of this painting seems to have been painted with a single hair brush. Yeah, absolutely.
If you look at
his painting, but because he was using oil paint in a way that had never really been used, and is able to create a kind of luminous quality, a richness of color that tempera simply couldn't achieve.
Yep, and he's doing this because he's applying thin, multiple layers or glazes of thinned out oil painting so that each layer is translucent, and layer after layer applied creates these incredibly deep, rich colors.
Which allows him to then produce this rich, luminous, incredibly subtle light. Look at the way that light comes in through this room and moves across the faces of the figures, their hands, across the furniture.
On the chandelier, the little shadow cast by that bottom bar of the window, there's a real love of light here that also is very typical of the Northern Renaissance.
And the way they can sort of brilliantly pick up a color, like on the oranges, for instance, or define an object such as Arnolfini's shoes.
Mm-hmm. The figures are kind of elongated. The space of the room seems very cramped. It's filled with all of these material objects.
It's certainly not perspectively correct.
Right, and both of those things, that lack of interest in human anatomy and a rational, perspectively correct space, really tell us that we're not in the Italian Renaissance, we're in the Northern Renaissance, that love of texture, the use of oil paint, the attention to detail. Van Eyck is a master, or the master of the Northern Renaissance.
2 years after Dürer finished his first painted self-portrait, he produced another in the year 1500, and we're looking at it now in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. And if you look on the left, you can see the 1500 painted in gold paint, and just below that, a large A and a small d, his signature, his insignia.
And it's really different from that earlier self-portrait.
Oh, it's so different. In the early portrait, he's dressed up as if he's a courtier, and he seems to be trying to show what he can do as a painter. Hire me, look what I can do.
Here he seems to liken himself to Christ.
Well, he's rendered himself full frontal, and that's a pose that is almost always reserved for Christ. It's not the most flattering pose. Painting that is so famous that it's become an icon of a nation.
We're looking at Grant Wood's American Gothic from 1930, which more than any other painting has come to represent America and middle America and small town America for many people. Wood said that this was a father and a daughter, but we know that the models were his dentist and his sister.
It's as contested as our nation is. It has as many readings as we have ideas about what our country is.
So in some ways it depends on which side of the political spectrum you're on. If you're a city person, you think that he's mocking the people who live in the Midwest, and if you're a Midwesterner, you think, oh, he's one of us and he captured who we are.
Although the opposite could also be true. The Easterners perhaps looked at these Iowans represented in this painting and said, that's what they're like. And the Iowans sometimes looked at this and were worried that they were being mocked.
There's a lot of meaning in this painting.
Okay, so we can look at it at face value at its most simplified and see this farmer, see perhaps, as the artist said, his daughter standing before their simple farm.
So we're looking at one of my favorite works of art from the last 30 or 40 years. This is Damien Hirst. And I'll admit that one of my favorite aspects of this work is its title.
I feel like just those words could be a work of art. I mean, I'm not even looking at the shark. The idea of the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living, and there's different ways to parse that actually. It's either wordplay or deep, and I haven't figured that out yet.
It strikes me as this great truth, the impossibility of really coming to terms with death as someone who's living. In many ways, the history of art is a coming to terms with mortality, of transcending the physical body, of the afterlife. Art through history has dealt with big questions. This is a work of art taking on those big questions.
Because I agree with you about the title. That title, I'm going to think about it all day. I mean, that's why we're so afraid of death, because we just can't process it. But
I'm Stephen Wiltshire. I'm an artist. I'm in New York City. New York is my favorite city.
Stephen is an artistic savant. I think drawing for Stephen is like air and water for us. He cannot live without it. I'm Stephen's sister. I'm extremely proud of him.
I'm gonna do a drawing of New York City from the memory. I feel excited. It's a beautiful city. Lots of skyscrapers. My favorite's the Empire State Building. It's a brilliant building. It was so beautiful out there. Nice and sunny.
Every aspect of what he sees comes alive on paper.
So this morning I figured it out. We'll start with the Brooklyn, up to the Midtown Manhattan, all the way to Queens. Gonna start now.
I would love to be in his mind to actually see how he sees things. Stephen was mute until the age of 5, so drawing was a form of his speech. This was his language. He has a phenomenal memory and is able to memorize cityscapes, landscapes, how many windows, floors, chimneys. To watch the ink touch the paper, it's almost like fine embroidery. You can actually see it develop. I never get tired of it.
This is it, it's done now. So I feel happy and good. I'm very proud of my work.
It's purely Stephen's own determination that he is where he is today.
Do the best you can and never stop.